If there was any justice, Aubrey Beardsley would have ended up in the movies. Beardsley himself was preoccupied with performance, movement, and stasis in his images, and he anticipates, in my view, the cinema's preoccupation with the viewer turned voyeur. But of course, Beardsley predeceased cinema as we know it. In February 1895, as Wilde received the note from Queensberry that would bring about the chain of events ending in his imprisonment and the end of the Yellow Book, the first Canopticon film, Incident at Clovelly Cottage, was being shot in Barnet, North London. Sometimes, though, I wonder, looking at Beardsley's images, whether he is sometimes alluding to early cinematic technologies, as Wilde does, in fact, in The Picture of Dorian Gray. Beardsley's minimalist two-dimensional black and white pictures are frequently compared to woodcuts, but they remind me too of the silhouetted images animated by the zoopraxiscope that Edward Muybridge toured with in the 1880s and 90s. And after looking at early cinematic machines, Beardsley's images of arrested movement have a slightly different resonance. So we often see in Beardsley, of course, a walk or a dance presented against itself like a single static frame taken out of a sequence. Suddenly, sometimes if you put Beardsley into the new context of cinema or different context we're not used to of cinema, suddenly his people begin to look a little like people on a screen, paused in medias res between frames from their start-stop animation. And quite often I kind of wonder whether if Beardsley's people moved, how would they move? That's just a frivolous question of my own, I guess, but I'd love to see them move. Today, though, I'm going to talk about how Beardsley posthumously became part of American cinema history, and I'm going to start in many ways where Margaret left us off. It's a story that begins not in London with Beardsley himself or with the Canopticon, but on America's East Coast, and then it takes us out west with the movie pioneers who created Hollywood's movie aesthetic. Beardsley first, and in this paragraph, I'm gonna go over a couple of contexts that Margaret mentioned. Okay, just so this is your refresher. So Beardsley's style first made a mark on America in Copeland and Day's first edition of Salome, complete with Beardsley's original illustrations seen here. And this began a trend in the little magazines. By the 1910s, and this is from 1895, but by the 1910s, America's newspapers and magazines were awash in grotesque and whimsical characters that were clearly Beardsley's children, drawn in economical black lines with an ironic hauteur and a hint of perversity, characteristics considered decidedly modern. Margaret mentioned Juna Barnes and her Beardsley-esque pictures in 1950 and mid-1910s. We might also remember William Faulkner's illustrations, first for the University of Mississippi Annual around in the late 1910s, and how Faulkner, you can see here, adopted the dehumanized angular lines of Beardsley's figures into striking compositions of jazz performance here on the left. And in that left-hand illustration, you can see too, I think, that Faulkner's Beardsleyism is refracted through the modern moving image. These are people who move fast. There's a live mobility in these figures who move with their whole bodies, whereas you often see Beardsley's figures, their feet are sort of on point, but the top halves of their bodies are not sinuous or lithe. You can see the same trends in this illustration from Bruno's Weekly, from 1916. The Beardsley Vogue went on, and in 1918, the writer Frank Peace declared that the US was in, quote, the vogue of Beardsley. Beardsley's reputation arguably peaked with major exhibitions in Chicago and New York in 1919, the first retrospectives indeed of his work. And we can see by the mid-1920s that this vogue of Beardsley was developing into a new form of American illustration. I really like Ralph Barton's illustrations. Now, on the left here, you can see a picture that he did after this one, after Aubrey Beardsley's Toilet of Salome, on the left. And then on the right, and I think this is interesting because the image on the right is much, much, much more famous. And that's an illustration he did for Anita Loos's But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes, the follow-up, of course, to The Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And we have in that right-hand illustration Lorelei and Dorothy in very similar poses, in the same kind of composition and design, with analogous expressions to those of Salome and her maid in his earlier illustration after Beardsley, in Barton's Beardsley phase. Beardsley's larger presence in American culture and in the movies is a mixed picture, and one that has foundations in the various faces of Beardsley we see through his American illustrator acolytes. Beardsley the avant-garde, Beardsley the grotesque, Beardsley the ludic, Beardsley the sexual deviant. In 1922, the prominent art critic S.L.M. Barlow called for American cinema to develop a distinctive visual aesthetic like German expressionism. And this is how he put it. He said, imagine a Hiroshage, a Beardsley, or a Rackham drawing, a series of pictures to be vitalized by the motion picture. Here, the camera would be essential. It would produce an authentic movie. Did Samuel Barlow know that even as he was writing this comment, in Los Angeles, there were two people plotting to use Beardsley as the foundation for a new kind of motion picture? And that was these people, Nazimova, Alla Nazimova and Natasha Rambova, the Garden of Allah, which was the inevitably named estate of Nazimova. In the 1923 screen adaptation of Wilde's play Salome by Nazimova and Rambova, they indeed imagined, as Barlow did, a series of Beardsley pictures vitalized by the motion picture, by the moving, as moving images. Here's the lobby card, one of the lobby cards, and this you can see in this lobby card, of course, Beardsley's illustration of the peacock skirt from the original Beardsley, Beardsley's original images for Wilde's text. Here wrapped around Nazimova, but the original head of Beardsley's figure has been replaced with Nazimova with a very fashionable bobbed haircut and peroxide blonde, as she appears in the film. Nazimova's Salome looked to expand the range of American cinema and its treatment of desire, and Nazimova looked to have found the perfect source material in Wilde's play and Beardsley's illustration. After all, it lends itself to the screen, the play itself and the illustrations, anticipating the cinematic imagination of the 20th century, with the play's insistent focus on the desiring gaze, now given piquancy in an age of cinematic voyeurs. Just as in Dorian Gray, the spectre of an autonomously moving figure in a frame gained new significance in a movie age. So Salome's preoccupation with looking, when presented on the big screen, became a self-reflexive meditation on cinema itself, or could and did in Nazimova's film. With the help of Beardsley's illustrations, in a period of increasing censorship, Nazimova and Rambova were able to suggest queer transgressions with impunity. And this is a really important thing, I think, about that film, or the kind of keynote to understanding why they're using Beardsley and what the significance is in 1923 on general release in the US. In a broad sense, the design of the film, and it was designed by Rambova, was fashionable as well as apt. Like the Beardsley-esque drawings of Ralph Barton, the mise-en-scène and costumes that she designed bring the fin de siècle into parallel with Jazz Age America, the bobbed hairstyles I mentioned, and also this fab white miniskirt that appears if you've seen the film. Look closer though, and what Rambova is doing is quite distinct from the popular image of Beardsley in America at that time. The set and props give much greater prominence to the symbolism in Beardsley's illustration than any of the other pastiches around that I'm aware of contemporaneously. She is representing female desire in the most Beardsley-esque fashion, with schoolboy double entendres of circles and archways and veiled entrances to suggest, well, I don't need to tell you, do I, to suggest female genitalia and sexual activity. We see here the way into Jokanan's cistern is this most elaborate gilded arched cage which Salome drapes herself over throughout the film, and then she is sort of in the archway of her own creation in the Dance of the Seven Veils with her bobbed hair. This sort of female sexual symbolism rebalances Beardsley's phallic imagery, the candelabras, the swords, the erect plant stems that we love so dearly from Beardsley's illustrations are fewer in this film. They're rebalanced with images of female sexuality. What this symbolism tells us, I think, is that this is a film primarily about homoerotic female sexuality. And this was picked up on by contemporary reviews, but a contemporary reviewer assured readers that, quote, only the highest of the highbrows will perceive its unwholesome aspect. For those highest of highbrows, though this was an artistic coup, female sexual desire encoded into the very design of the film. This eroticism is integral to Rambova's designs. Like the costume designs for the Ballet Russe 1913 production of Salome, and they're in the middle there for you. They're in the middle of the screen for you. What she does is she emphasizes the dramatic and whimsically curved line of Beardsley's boldest two-tone patterns. The capacious kimono robe worn by Salome in the film, seen on the right here, enlarges the black and white sweeping lines of Beardsley's peacock skirt, seen on the left, the far left, and also the dancer's reward. In the film, after walking upstage with Jokanan's head on a silver platter, she kneels to the floor and covers herself and the platter with this gown, with this robe that we see on the right, and so that she can kiss the severed head unseen, and it sort of aestheticizes that morbid kiss. We don't see the grotesque spectacle, but the triumph of beautiful style. We see elsewhere too that Rambova adapts Beardsley's original illustrations, exaggerating and stylizing them further, as with this robe, also with those peacock feathers, the peacock feather design seen to the left of the right-hand picture in Beardsley's image, the climax, and seen on the gorgeous leggings of the page on the right of the left-hand image. The robe, we also see, you can't quite see, but the page has a pom-pom wig on as well, teamed with oversized pearl necklaces, such that you can see on his bare chest as well, and sort of pantomime gestures. The impression is over the top, even for silent film. Today it kind of looks camp, but it wasn't straightforwardly camp. It anticipates camp, drawing attention to its style for its own sake, theatricalizing gender roles to the point of parody. But really, Beardsley's impish humour might have just as easily, been rolled into the carnivalesque momentum of surrealist comedy in another possible universe, his satyrs are extras, in my mind at least, in a Marx Brothers film. We could think of the Page and Naraboth, not out of place in the Court of Fredonia in Duck Soup, the Marx Brothers film from 1933. But Nazimova doesn't adopt the humor of Beardsley. The potential for fun is arrested, and we see that there's this tension at the heart of Nazimova's Salome between the comedy potential of characters like those on the left and the tone and pace of her scenario. With the hindsight of a century, it's all too clear that Salome by Rambova and Nazimova was an outlier in the development of Hollywood into a mass entertainment industry. It was too queer, too arty to ever really make a splash beyond small art house circles. However, Beardsley's countercultural edge was never lost, even when it was adapted for the demands of the mass market. By that, I mean that even the most innocuous Beardsley-esque illustrations contain within them, enfolded from the 1890s, untold and tacitly understood sexual transgression, and filmmakers loved that. And I'm thinking particularly of this wonderful film. Now, if you have a spare hour and you like classic horror, then I would take a look at The Black Cat, a B-movie horror film. Beardsley's aesthetic fertilizes horror in this film, which is partly inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's short story of the same name. The plot, I'm not giving anything away here, the plot focuses on a young couple traveling in Europe, and they become stranded at the mountaintop house of a mad scientist, as you do, played by Boris Karloff, who else, and they become stranded with him and his former friend from before the World War, played by Bela Lugosi. And Lugosi wants vengeance for the mysterious disappearance of his wife. As these old foes are brought back together, the former friend is increasingly affected by the presence of his host's strange black cat, which seems to signify an evil presence in the house. Now, the main aesthetic inspiration for the Black Cat was not Poe, not according to the writer and director Edgar Ulmer, but Beardsley's illustration of Poe, from 1894. Edgar Ulmer said in an interview at the time that the visual design of the film, which is very striking, which I'll mention more in a second, was based specifically on Beardsley's style to reinforce his aim that the Karloff and Lugosi characters should, quote, appear as abhorrent as possible, a stable of misfits, members of the decadent aristocracy of the countryside, end quote. In the film, the cat appears as a solid black shadow seen repeatedly in sharp silhouette against a white wall. Here's a publicity shot, which is the best one, best image I could get, but it appears throughout the film. Likewise, the very first image of the Karloff's character sitting up in bed shows him for a moment as a black figure, stock still, sitting up as the doorbell rings. With images like these, and with the next here, sorry, that's just a snapshot I took on my computer, sorry for the light bleeding in. Ulmer creates two-tone tableau like Beardsley's, dramatizing large black shapes next to expanses of white interrupted by only minimalist lines. He takes Beardsley's grotesques and he turns them into menacing, moving horror. In so doing so, Ulmer kind of makes me pause to think as well about Beardsley in the larger scope of film aesthetics, and maybe someone here will know more about this than I do, because in my mind, if we didn't know about what Ulmer said about Beardsley, if we didn't have that, the Black Cat is most obviously part of an evolution in cinematic aesthetics that doesn't have anything to do with Beardsley, but which rather goes German Expressionism in the early 20s. These images here, and then through to film noir in the 1940s. But I do wonder whether, as I say, I can't do any more than pose this as a question, whether Beardsley might have been an influence in German Expressionism. Ulmer came to Hollywood from Berlin, and he claimed to have been a set designer on M and the Golem. The Golem was one of the images I showed there. He claimed to be a set designer on the Golem and on M. So if Ulmer himself is citing Beardsley as the force behind his designs in The Black Cat, might there be some credence in John Russell's view in 1967 that were it not for Beardsley, then German Expressionist graphics would have been very different? That there was this kind of important influence of Beardsley on German Expressionism. With that, we'll move on to something quite different, but the suggestion of perversity that underlies the horror of The Black Cat is a subversive force once more in our final example of Beardsley in Hollywood. That is, on the face of it, a very different example, and it takes us forward to 1946. And Vincent Minnelli, one of the most famous directors, I'm sure you know, and the ultimate director of the on-screen musical in Hollywood. Ziegfeld Follies is a revue film comprising a series of lavish musical numbers and comedy sketches performed by an all-star cast. Minnelli directed the big budget sequences and Minnelli, a big fan of Oscar Wilde, insisted that one of the sequences used the leftover set from the 1945 adaptation of the picture of Dorian Gray. So that appears oddly in Ziegfeld Follies. But even odder, to my mind at least, was the appearance of Aubrey Beardsley. Now, in musical films, as the film critic Matt Tinkham has suggested, song and dance occur in the space of spectacle. It's in excess of realist codes. And Ziegfeld Follies heightens this spectacle to a camp zenith. Both realism and the teleology of the heterosexual romance narrative that we're used to in musicals are suspended by those grand scale, really over-the-top numbers in the film. And it becomes possible to imagine a deviation from a heteronormative teleology of boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy sings a song and gets girl, the trajectory we're used to from the Hollywood musical. In this context, in Ziegfeld Follies, comes this song and dance sequence. Now, it's killing me that I can't play it to you, but I'm worried that I will crash the whole session if I did. So you can see it. I've checked on YouTube. If you just search for Astaire and This Heart of Mine, it's a 12-minute sequence. So I could never play the whole thing anyway. So in this context, we get to this sequence called This Heart of Mine, designed by Tony Duquette and Vincent Minnelli himself, and performed, of course, by Fred Astaire and Lucille Bremer. As the sequence opens, it has something we might not be expecting from a sequence starring Astaire and Bremer, and that's a Beardsley-esque satyr, suddenly as the establishing shot for the sequence. And in a sense, this shot began my whole journey into decadence and Hollywood, because I love musicals, but I didn't understand what this was doing here. And I thought, well, whoever designed this knew Beardsley. He must have done. So so this has been a sort of 11-year journey to find out how he knew Beardsley. So as the camera goes from this establishing shot and pans to the right, we see that this is just one of 10 masked satyrs presiding over a circular ballroom. The figures are, in my view at least, an ostensible reference to Aubrey Beardsley's masked satyrs, and in particular, they bear a remarkable resemblance to his cover illustration for the Yellow Book, complete with candles and mask, and of course. Positioned right at the beginning of this Heart of Mine, these figures suggest the ludic eroticism and parodic ambiguity surrounding personal identity, as symbolized by Beardsley's figures, I think. They operate in the same way as Beardsley's drawing in the Yellow Book, or on the front of the Yellow Book. The figures surrounding the ballroom, creating a space within commercial art for the social and sexual deviant. The individual who, sitting alone in the back row of the movie theatre, might identify with the statue's ironic glance toward a heteronormative society event. Is it a coincidence? Well, I don't think so, because in 1930 in New York, Vincent Minnelli illustrated an edition of Casanova's memoirs in what he referred to in his memoirs as in the Aubrey Beardsley style, fashionable at the time, end quote. And it was in Greenwich Village where he lived. Minnelli's illustrations, executed in pen and ink, are characterized by the suffocating artificiality of Beardsley's cluttered interior scenes. And he incorporates a number of Beardsley's motifs, such as Venetian masks, draperies, satyrs, candles, flower heads, punctuating the scene to add to their perverse artificiality. The drawings aren't anything remarkable, but they remind us that Minnelli was one of that generation of people who grew up in the vogue of Beardsley and who participated in it to keep the wolf from the door at a time when he wasn't making a lot of money any other way. And it stayed with him. It was in the fabric of his identity as a filmmaker, though we rarely see it displayed as ostensibly as an image or a Beardsley-esque image. In defiance of the motion picture production code, the sequence, This Heart of Mine, privileges aesthetic value over accepted contemporary moralities, just as Decadence did. The extravagant style of this musical number in a vast and visually striking set, opulent ball gowns and large-scale choreography, all of which emphasize visual style over narrative substance, provide the ground on which the musical number subverts prescribed moralities of the contemporary marriage plot musical. So Astaire's character isn't a society gentleman, but he's a would-be jewel thief, a playboy, a deceiver. He hits on Lucille Bremer. He dances with her. He sings to her. It's a spontaneous and sexually charged encounter. And as they kiss at the end, and you can see the kiss at the top left-hand corner. As they kiss at the end, he steals her diamond bracelet and puts it in his pocket. And then he walks her to the door, and showing that she knows exactly what he's doing, she takes off her necklace very calmly and gives it to him in his hand. He begins to walk away, and this is the bit that the storyboard here, which I'm very grateful for being put together, but what it leaves out is that just before just before the penultimate frame, Minnelli's camera pans back to the Beardsley figure and shows us that figure and lingers on it, and then it goes back to Astaire. And she runs to him, and then they have another very lengthy kiss before walking off into the night together. The heiress's desire for the jewel thief evokes the deviancy of Beardsley-esque morality and desire twice over. The would-be criminal goes unpunished, but more than this, his flirtation with the heiress in the final minute of the sequence turns to become driven by her deviant desires, not his. She wants him because he's a wrong un, and she loves that. Minnelli's camera, returning to that Beardsley-esque satire in those final moments, self-consciously emphasizes the sexual deviancy of the encounter between Astaire and Bremer, for those in the know, for those who know what that means. And because it clearly evokes the transaction of jewels for sexual services, and takes us back to Beardsley. To conclude, Beardsley's legacy in the American movies was inconsistent, and it fizzled out by the 1950s, at least according to my reckoning, as did Oscar Wilde's, come to think of it. But it was the fading light of Beardsley's supernova explosion into American cultural life in the first years of the 20th century. Still, while it lasted, Beardsley's influence was really important. His perversity of line, his figures offered a suggestion of sexual deviancy that could never be made explicit. Not on screen in Salome, in The Black Cat, or Ziegfeld Follies, not at the time of censorship, of movie censorship. And at the same time, Beardsley's style did contribute, as S.L.M. Barlow once dared to hope it might, in the formation of a distinctly American film aesthetic. The subversive excesses that it suggested, the chiaroscuro lighting, which developed in symbiotic relation with Beardsley's presence in American culture, helping to make something new and something distinctly American and not quite as pure and homegrown and focused on family values as many of the screen moguls would like to believe.